Hey everyone, Nick from Accounting Add-ons here, and in this video I'll provide a quick introduction to DAX so you can see it in action and get up and running with it. Now to showcase DAX, we'll create a simple dashboard that will calculate the percentage of invoices paid within Xero. Now as always, the approach we take is essentially the same regardless of source data, so it'll work equally well in MYOB. But different endpoints or accounting packages will of course have different field names. Now let's get into it. So the first thing I'll need to do is get access to the invoices. So I'll jump to the OdataLink website and I'll go OData Feeds and I'll copy my URL for the demo company and click OK. I can then jump into Power BI and I can go Get Data from OData Feed, paste my URL, click OK, and what I'll do is I'll select the Invoices Expanded endpoint, click Transform. Now I'll remove all the columns and fields that I'm not really interested in, just to keep it nice and concise. Once done, I can click Close and Apply, and it'll download my data into Power BI. Finally, to make the names a bit nicer, I'll right-click on the Invoices Expanded, choose Rename, and I'll rename it to Invoices. I'll start off by creating two simple tables in Power BI. So I'll drag two tables into Power BI. In my first table, I'll include the type of invoice as well as the amount. And in my second table, I'll include the contact name as well as the amount. Now what we want to do is calculate a percentage paid column. So we'll have a look at our data. And if I jump to the data table, we can actually see that there's different types of invoices status. Some are marked as paid, some are marked as deleted. We've got authorized, submitted, draft. So really we're not interested in the ones that have been deleted because they shouldn't exist, and we're not interested in the draft ones. We're really only interested in the paid, the authorized, and the submitted one. So we'll keep that in mind when we build our DAX formula. The first measure we'll want to create will be to sum up all the invoices that are paid. So we'll right-click on our table and choose New Measure. Now this measure will be called Total Invoice Paid, and we'll use the calculate function to convert a normal value into a measure. The first parameter of the calculate function will be to sum the invoices total, and the second parameter will be used to filter it. So we're only interested in invoices whose status is equal to paid. Once we do that, we can click out and we've got our measure created. Now one thing I like to do is actually space out my measure a bit more so that it's slightly easier to read and understand where the parameters are. Like that. But this is just optional. It's just to actually format it to make it a bit more easier to read and a bit more user-friendly. Now once we've done this, we can actually return back to our Power BI model and we can actually drag this measure onto both tables. And if we do that, we can actually see it's calculated the different amounts. Notice that the total is the same for both columns of both tables because it's using the same source data, but on each individual row, it's calculated different figures. Now the next formula we'll create will be essentially the same syntax, but instead of just looking at paid invoices, it'll look at paid, submitted, and authorized. So the first thing I'll do is I'll actually click on my invoice to copy this formula. I don't want to have to retype all this. And I can then right click and choose New Measure, and I can paste my formula. Now this will be called Total Invoice Amount. And the rest of the formula is pretty correct, but what will change is instead of being only the paid invoices, we'll actually change this to look at three types of values. Now we're adding the pipe parameters because that does an OR clause, so it'll either be authorized or submitted or paid. And if we click out, the formula is built. We can drag this column onto both tables. We can place it in the correct spot if we need to. And we've actually pulled out all the invoice amount. You can see it calculates 103,000. Because it only looks at specific values. It's removing the deleted and the draft invoices, which is why the total is 107, but the invoice amount measure that we created is 103. Now there's one final measure we want to calculate, which will be the paid percentage. To do that, we'll right click and choose new measure, and we'll call it paid percent. And this one will be slightly different than the other two. We don't need to use the calculate function because it'll be based entirely on measures. So it'll be invoices paid divided by invoices total amount. And if we click out, we can actually drag the paid percentage column onto both tables. Now notice it's showing up as 0.71, 0.60 and 0.64. It's actually being recalculated on Nitro just like the other ones. But I want to show it as a percentage, so I'll click on my measure, and at the very top you can actually see you can choose the format of the measure. We'll just change it to be a percentage, and it'll actually display as a percentage on both tables. Now, since we're new to DAX, there's other ways we can also write a measure. One way is to use the quick measure dialog. So we can right click and choose new quick measure. And this dialog allows us to build a measure just by dragging and dropping different fields. And there's all kinds of different quick measures we can use. One is the filtered value, where we can actually drag the columns we want. So for instance, we can tell it to sum the total, and we can then filter by status and tick only the paid invoices. And if we click OK, it'll create a formula called total for paid. We can drag that into our table, which will produce the exact same value, although the syntax is just slightly different. That's another quick way to build measures if you're not too familiar with the DAX syntax. The same DAX formulas can also be used in Excel. I've got an Excel spreadsheet here, which I've already pulled the invoices in. And to add a pivot table, I can use the drop down from Data Model, Existing Sheet, and click OK. That'll add my invoices table, and I can do the same thing as dragging the contact name and the total. To add our measure, we can right click on our table and choose Add Measure. We can give it a name, Total Invoice Paid, and the formula will be essentially the same, calculate sum of the total, where the invoice status equals paid. And we'll repeat that a few times. And we're done. Finally, we can drag our columns into our report, and we'll notice it produces the exact same figures as in Power BI. So that brings us to the end of the video regarding DAX, and I hope you found this tutorial and introduction really useful. I'll catch you next time. Take care.